Hello everyone, this is Dr. Pritpal Singh Matreja, an MBBS MD from CMC Ludhiana, and till now we have been discussing about the outcome measures which we were talking about in the last few sessions, and we'll continue with those outcome measures and assessments, and we'll conclude the final session on outcome assessment today. And I hope that this particular session and the previous three sessions prove beneficial to you so as to have a proper evaluation of the outcome of any research protocol. And what I'll be doing is I'll be starting with a recap of what we have been doing, what has been done previously, and what is further required and how we can proceed ahead. So we'll start with this outcome measures, and when we started with this outcome measures, it is basically to improve patient safety, and is also important to evaluate the effectiveness of solution in real life setting in the term of their impact, acceptability, and affordability. And we tried to evaluate several methods for evaluation. Now, if we go by the definition, as per the definition, an outcome is a measurable individual, family, or community state, behavior, or perception that is measured along a continuum and in response to clinical intervention. And when we talk about an outcome measure, it is a set of items that are used to create scores that are intended to quantify a patient's performance or health status based on standardized evaluation protocols or closed-ended questions. So why do we want a standardized outcome instrument? So that documentation can be there in electronic records. It could be used for clinical information system for the development of clinical knowledge and professional education. And it could also be used for resource allocation and accountability. We were talking about these components where we start with measuring harm, understand the cause, identify the solution. We tend to evaluate the impact, and then this is translated into safer care. Further, we go ahead with measuring the harm, and this cycle keeps on moving further. And we talked about the 6 T's of the outcome research, which involve death, disease, disability, discomfort, dissatisfaction, and dollars. Now, as per the Health Research Agency for Health Research and Quality, outcome is based on what works, what doesn't work, at what time does it work, and what is the cost involved with it. So we do not have, as such, we do not have any uniform definition. And outcome research is scientific study of results of diverse therapies for particular disease, condition, or illness. And this is linked to evidence-based medicine. So these are the various clinical measures that we have been talking about: mortality, complications, pathology, lab abnormalities, deformities, and signs and symptoms. And then we talked about these categories of patient's outcome, which could be clinician reported, physiological, caregiver reported, and patient reported. Though patient reported is used in most of the studies, but nowadays caregiver reported is also assuming significance, as well as clinician reported is also our first-hand evidence or for evidence-based medicine. So we need to have a study outline. What we need to look at the baseline of the patient, what is the treatment he is receiving, and what is the response that is coming out. We also need to take care of the bias and confounders. Bias as such could be a selection bias or a treatment bias. Confounders could be anything varying from age, gender, ethnicity, race, and comorbidities. So how do we want to know about the safer care? It is related to the frequency of harm associated with it, any change in practice in the response to learning, and improvement in safety culture. We talked about these baseline conditions where we talk about disease severity and comorbidities. We talked about this Donner-Median process where we talk about pathophysiology, symptoms, physical and mental health, as well as the quality of life. And when we talk about the domains of quality, it could include safety, effectiveness, patient-centeredness, efficiency, timelines, and repeatable. Now, the various outcomes with different perspectives could be the clinical perspective, the patient's perspective, the societal perspective, which includes utilization and cost, whereas the patient's perspective includes subjective health status, quality of life, and satisfaction. The safety measures could be the harm, the appropriate care, the learning, and the safety culture incorporated. We discussed this particular example, and we also talked about the evaluation process, which could be a direct measure, it could be indirect measure, or it could be related to the outcome. And we have to learn from our mistakes where we measure the presence of a particular policy or program. We check the knowledge of the staff and we go for the appropriate use of policy or program. Now, these were the checklists that we tried to make up for a teamwork and safety climate survey. And then we talked about the cost analysis, the cost outcome, where it could include the cost identification, the cost effectiveness, which includes the quality adjusted life years or disease adjusted life years, and the cost benefits associated with this particular treatment. And for the assessment of the treatment, we need a control group that is there. We also talked about the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is when efficacy study is a study which is under tightly controlled conditions, whereas in the clinical practice settings, whatever we are doing is the effectiveness study. So when we talk about efficacy, it is a health intervention which is done in a controlled environment and it tends to achieve better outcome than does placebo. Whereas when we are talking about effectiveness, it retains its value under usual clinical circumstances that we are talking about the daily clinical practice. And then we talked about these various levels of evidence, whereas randomized controlled trial has a high level of evidence based upon whether this RCT is a high quality RCT or a low quality RCT. And when then we have the observational study, if it is with a control group, it has a higher level of evidence, and without a control group, it has a lower level of evidence. Case control studies coming below that, a case series even further lower down, and then expert opinion are the last or the least significance for level of evidence. This is what we were talking about, the ABCD. The A is the highest level of evidence, which is seen in RCTs of high quality. Low quality RCTs or maybe the cohort studies with control group come under the B level of evidence, whereas uh, and case control studies are also under B level of evidence. Case series are the C level of evidence, and the lowest level of evidence lies in the expert opinion. Now, there are certain habits that you need to form for to be highly effective data user. You should always check quality, describe before you analyze, accept the uncertainty of all data, measure errors with right statistical test, put clinical importance before statistical significance, seek the sample source, and view science as a cumulative process. So the first thing is check quality before quantity. We want to go for experimental versus observational study. We have to look into the biases. We have to look into confounders, the control group, any response to the placebo that is obviously seen in the experimental group, and prospective study where we can measure incidence for new events, or a retrospective studies where we can measure prevalence. Describe before you analyze. You need to look for the measurement scales that would be there, whether the data is categorical data, the numerical data. Categorical is for qualitative data, numerical data, which is for whether it follows a bell-shaped curve with standard deviation or not, the median and the survival curve, whatever is being used. Now, whenever we are talking about the categorical data, it could be dichotomous, which could be two mutually exclusive categories, that is either yes or no or male or female. Nominal could be unordered qualitative categories such as race, religion, country of origin, whereas ordinal is ordered qualitative category but with no natural numerical distance between their possibility, like mild, moderate, severe, low, medium, high, and age group. So we could always calculate odds ratio for a case control study. Relative risk is there with which can be there with prospective reviews such as a cohort study, and we could look for rate differences with prospective trials. Correlation coefficient could be applied with ordinal or numerical data, whereas the coefficient R from 0 to 0.25 indicates little or no relationship. 2.25 to 0.49 has a fair relationship. 0.50 to 0.74 a moderate to good relationship, and a greater than 0.75 has excellent relationship, whereas a perfect linear relationship would be when the coefficient of correlation yields 1.00. Then there are a certain uncertainties in all data, and what we need to take care about the precision. Precision is When this particular data is repeatedly done, whatever is reported, it should be within 95% confidence interval, and this precision may be increased by using a more reproducible measure. By increasing the number of observations, we can increase the sample size to increase the precision, or we could decrease the variability among the observations. And accuracy measures nearest to the truth. So this is measured in an unbiased manner and reflects what is truly purported to be measured. Then there are errors. There could be certain errors we need to measure with right statistical test. So all statistical tests measure, they tend to measure certain amount of error, but we need to choose the right test is, and this is determined by whether the observation set comes from independent or related samples, whether the purpose is to compare groups or to associate an outcome with one or more predictable variables, and the measurement scale of the variable. So we have certain terms that have been used, and we'll talk about these terms in a nutshell. Null hypothesis is where the result observed in a study, whether experimental or test, shows that there are no different from what might have occurred due to chance alone. Statistical test is the procedure used to reject or accept the null hypothesis that we are talking about. Type 1 error is rejecting a true null hypothesis, that is, we want to go for the false positive error, where we declare that a difference exists when in fact it does not. P-value is the probability of making type 1 error. P less than 0.05 indicates a statistical significant result that is unlikely to be caused by chance. Type 2 error or beta error is accepting a false null hypothesis, that is also known as a false negative error, where declaring that a difference does not exist when in fact it does. यहाँ पे out here we were talking about there is a difference, uh, declaring that a difference exists when in fact it does not. Out here we declare that difference does not exist when in fact it does, and the power is the probability that the null hypothesis will be rejected if it is indeed false. Mathematically, power is 1 minus plus minus type 2 error. That means when we are declaring the difference, this is the false negative. When we try to rule out this false negative, we tend to analyze the power of the study. We have to put the clinical importance before statistical significance. The next logical question that is there a difference? This is statistical significance. And how big is the difference is the clinical importance. The effect size could be reflects the magnitude of the difference between the groups, and it is measured by correlation coefficient. Confidence intervals are more appropriate measures of clinical importance than p-value because they reflect both magnitude and precision. In significance, the result, the lower limit of 95% confidence interval should be scrutinized. A value of minimal clinical importance suggests low precision, and if it is non-significant, the upper limit of confidence interval should be scrutinized, and a value indicating a potential important clinical effect suggests low statistical power, which is a false negative finding. We need to seek the sample source. A statistical test is valid only when the study sample is random and representative. We have to identify the sampling method and selection criteria, and that were applied to the target population to study the sample size. When the process appears sound, one concludes the results are generalizable. So how do we view science as we view science as a cumulative process where the process of integration, systemic review, and all process of integration guides the systemic review or meta-analysis, and this meta-analysis further guides the clinical practice guidelines. Now, some of the popular statistical tests that are used for measuring the difference between the outcome measures is t-test, where we tend to compare the mean of two independent or matched samples of numerical data. ANOVA, where there are three or more independent groups of continuous data, and they differ significantly with regard to a single factor or two factor. If it is a single factor, it is one-way ANOVA. Two factor, it is two-way. Then we could go for contingency table, where the association between two categorical variables are analyzed by using chi-square test. We could go for survival analysis, as in case of oncologic studies or cancer studies on cancer chemotherapy, which is also known as Kaplan-Meier survival analysis. Now, this estimates the probability of an event based on the total period of observation, or it could be multivariate regression analysis, where simultaneous effects of multiple predictors are analyzed on an outcome of interest. Now, there are certain statistical deceptions that we should be aware of, and these statistical deceptions include standard error if it is used instead of standard deviation. Small sample study results are taken at face value. Post hoc p value are used for statistical interference. Some results are significant, but there is a large number of p values. Subgroups are compared until statistical significant results are found. There is no significant difference found between group in a sample study. Significant p value are crafted through improper use of hypothesis test. What are the various benefits of outcome measurements for health professions? It tends to individually, it tends to help us in clinical decision and competence, and for a group, it tends to have an accountability. For colleagues or referral services, it acts as a communication media, includes and or as an organization, it increases efficiency. For a patient's perspective, it helps in communication and engagement, and for an organization value, it tends to have effectiveness. For an insurer or a payer, this communication and claim decision is done, and for group or organization, it is value, and for the scientist, it tends to evaluate the benefit and check the effectiveness. There are certain barriers, and these barriers could be at the level of an individual or an organization. Barriers at the time of individual could be time, knowledge, resource, competency, or attitude. And in the case of organizational, it could be time and cost, policy, culture, of lack of consensus. So in case of individuals, there is not sufficient time to research, administer, score, or interpret, not enough knowledge or barrier of knowledge for selection and interpretation. Few of the many limited resources are available. Education and routine or experiences are limited. Attitude that outcome measures are unnecessary, skeptical, or there is overwhelmed, or there is lack of confidence in use of a particular effectiveness study molecule. For our organizational, it could require investment, and maybe compensation is one of the major issues. There is no policy for poor adherence or compliance. The culture is there is a conflict of interest at the micro and macro level, and there is no specific lack of consensus. So to summarize about the outcome measures, these outcome measures, they can evaluate the impact of intervention in terms of outcome or processes and the underlying culture. They need to engage in healthcare workers in selection, development of a measure to evaluate safety and success of intervention. And organizations should identify a few useful measures to be collected systematically. So whenever we are looking for any intervention, we always go for safety and effectiveness measure, and maybe in case of prospective or retrospective studies, we could go for some other measures that are there. And with this, I come to the end of the session on outcome measures, and I hope that some points are clear with this particular outcome measure. And if there's any issues or any problems that still remain unresolved, I would be happy to answer them. You could inbox me and I'll definitely get back to you. So with this, I end the session on outcome measure. Until we meet again, all of you have a good day and a happy learning experience. Thank you. Thank you very much.